Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today is Ciara Haley, co-founder of The Gaggle. And we are fortunate to have with us once again renowned litigator and outstanding political analyst, Robert Bannons, who is in Las Vegas. Well, a lot has happened, Robert, since you were with us last. We had the January the 6th events, and we've had an impeachment, and now we're coming up to a trial. And I want to really get your take on what's going to happen. First of all, will there actually be a trial, or will the Trump defense move for a summary dismissal? In other words, even if every single thing that the Trump is charged with is true, there's still no crime because it's unconstitutional. And if it then, can they take this to the Supreme Court? And if they do take it to the Supreme Court, how would the Supreme Court rule? And it will say, if the Supreme Court actually takes Trump's side, is the Senate obligated to follow what the Supreme Court says, or can they, because it's a co-equal branch of government? So a lot of questions there, Robert, and you're the man to explain it.
Sure. So, Alan Dershowitz, Jonathan Turley, some others have recommended a variety of strategies. One was to, rather than go through the trial, go through the court system first, move to stay the trial pending adjudication of the case on the grounds that the Senate has no authority to try to punish a private citizen, which is what they're doing now. So then on multiple grounds. First, the impeachment clause itself within the Constitution only refers to the removal of an officer. It does not, it has the additional remedy of disbarring them from seeking or obtaining that office again. But the reason for that was the idea of, let's say you had a secretary, some cabinet official or some other official who could be reappointed automatically by, say, the president, even if he'd been impeached. The theory was we don't want to do impeached and then he gets right back in and we have to impeach again. And so the point of disbarment was to preclude that situation from occurring. It was not as a separate, independent, standalone remedy. And thus the conjunctive "and" is used in the Constitution. So the first part is the Constitution only talks about impeaching officers, not impeaching people who are used to be officers. So arguably that by itself makes it unconstitutional. The second part is there's something called a bill of attainder in the Constitution, which is prohibited. And this was back in the old English Parliament days where they used to actually try to punish individuals, try individuals, to hold something against an individual. And it was really hated at the time of our founding in America. And so it was said the Parliament, our legislatures can never do that. They can't target an individual to punish them, to try to publicly humiliate them solely for that goal. There's no criminal jurisprudence in the Congress. Well, that's what this is. The only exception is an officer, but solely for the purpose of removing them from office, not punishment of a private citizen. And that's effectively what this is. So it's really an unconstitutional bill of attainder. And then the third part is it really violates First and Fifth Amendment provisions. So because this is clear speech, nothing about what Trump said meets the definition of illegal incitement in the United States, which is you have to expressly call for a criminal action that can be imminently performed. If those three factors are not present, then you can't do it. This also fits within what they call true threats jurisprudence in the United States, which, there's people that have said all kinds of things. Madonna famously said about Trump, she dreams of it being blown up. None of those things were actionable because they didn't have the probability of imminent incitement. In Trump's case, he didn't even ask anyone to do anything illegal. He specifically said, let's do a peaceful, patriotic walk to the Capitol. And the people who breached the Capitol weren't even at the speech and had been planning what they were planning far in advance of the speech. So there is, it's a First Amendment violation, and the limitation that doesn't, somehow people think that if you call it impeachment, all the rest of the Constitution vanishes. The First Amendment no longer applies. The Fifth Amendment due process no longer applies. They're confusing the historical power of Congress to ignore the Constitution with what the Constitution actually says. So in the past, famously, Adam Clayton Powell was excluded from Congress in the late 1960s. He challenged it. The lower courts were like, it's a political question. We'll let we can't interfere with Congress. The Supreme Court disagreed by an 8-1 margin. They said Congress's power is a question for the courts first and foremost, not just for Congress. And they overturned it and said they had no right to exclude Adam Clayton Powell, a duly elected congressman, from Congress. They could constitutionally expel him if they wanted to, based on conduct that took place within Congress, but they couldn't exclude him from the get-go. And so on all of those grounds, and of course, the House provided no due process of any kind. So the other way the president could challenge it is that he's been denied due process already and would be on a continuous basis. So the Bill of Attainder violation, First Amendment violation, Fifth Amendment violation, and this not fitting the constitutional definition of impeachment were all grounds he could challenge in the courts. So he could have challenged in the courts. He still can challenge in the courts. However, it appears he won't. Now, he may move to dismiss before the Senate, but what's happening is this is a constant refrain in Trump world over his last 4 years, and it hasn't stopped. He decided to hire someone at the recommendation of Lindsey Graham. And so the defense is almost being structured by Lindsey Graham as much as it is by Trump. Lindsey Graham's pitch is don't challenge the Senate's power, don't go to court, don't contest it in that way. Also telling him don't use it as an opportunity to document issues related to the election and whether the election was on the up and up in 2020. Don't be in any way dismissive of the proceedings on whether it's a violation of constitutional provisions to even hold them. Just hold a limited trial presentation that still argues that the Senate may not have the authority to do so, but more so argue that the Senate, that he didn't do anything that was in fact impeachable, was a high crime or misdemeanor. He did no illicit incitement and so forth. So now they've already brought one motion to dismiss. Rand Paul forced it through the Senate. That let everybody know that there was no chance of impeachment passing since only 5 Republican senators departed. So much like the House, about 10% of the elected Republican officials deviated. And that's 12 short of what they need to convict. And in order to remove them, they need to convict them first. Removal can be a majority vote in the interpretation of the Senate. I disagree with that, but they can only vote to remove if they first vote to convict. And he's not going to be convicted. So the pitch is for him to do a short trial, not extend it, not expand it, not drag it out, and to be very sort of kind and deferential and cordial and limited in his defensive proceedings. So he's not going to go the Turley route of not showing up, but he is because that would be seen as dismissive. We'll see the reality is the Republican Party was never going to implode over actually getting to 6 to 67 votes. So whether this is the right move or not is an open question. Some of us had publicly urged that he take it to the courts to make it clear courts can't do this. But if it's going to go down this path, then we'll have some fun down the road, I suppose. We can be like the old papal conventions and some of the Oliver Cromwell trial and the rest, and bring out the dead and put them on trial.
Just a kind of a quick follow-up. And then the presiding quote judge unquote will be Patrick Leahy. Does he also get a vote as a juror? So is he judge and juror at the same time?
It's another way in which the self is making a self-satirical mockery in this entire proceeding. Because, of course, the Chief Justice is supposed to preside over any trial involving the president. Theoretically, they're impeaching the president. They're just impeaching him as an ex-president. But it's clear Roberts wanted nothing to do with this kind of show. So he made it clear he wasn't coming. And rather than force a public confrontation, they decided, well, we'll just make one of our own senators the judge. I mean, this is not good. And so that's that by itself just shows how unconstitutional the whole process is. But you're right. They have no answer for that second question. Is he a juror when he's also the judge? The whole theory is that you have a judge who's impartial, not that he's sitting on the jury too. And so it may be the case that he does not vote. They have no idea what they're doing. They're just winging it at this point. I mean, this is an embarrassment. And I get that they're still horrified that the plebes and the peasants came to their mighty building and rather than curtsying and bowing, decided to put their feet up on the speaker's desk. And we had a federal judge yesterday shaking in rage at the horror of this. So it's they're exposing themselves at a deep level. People like Michael Malice must be having a field day because he saw this, from his anarchistic perspective of unmasking the joke and the cruel joke that the system is. You combine that with what the news happened in GameStop this week, and the whole system keeps showing the emperor truly has no clothes, and they get most enraged when somebody points it out.
Robert, I just wanted to ask, do you foresee any unexpected twists happening with this trial? Because I know Democrats are trying to wrap it up quite quickly at this stage, or at least get it over with as quickly as possible. But is there something that they can do after the impeachment falls through or after the trial wraps up that they might try and pull out?
There were people encouraging him, and Trump was tempted to use the trial to expose a whole bunch and embarrass a bunch of officials. But he has been told, and his South Carolina lawyer apparently is not going to pursue those. So he could have used the trials as an opportunity to put on all the evidence of election issues that were never fully adjudicated. He could have also used the trials. I was encouraging him to dig deeper into what exactly did happen on January the 6th. So Rand Paul has had his rhetorical response to the Democrats' weakness in general on this issue, and that we're now calling things insurrection, sedition, domestic terrorism, that just all summer I was told are just a form of protesting. So it's and people got to witness it, and when people are really witnessing it is if it's my little small business, you can come and burn it down. You can shut it down and then you can burn it down. But by golly, if I put my feet up on your desk and you're one of the mighty few, then I'll be locked into prison for pending trial, as actually happened. Right. So my view was he could have used the trial as the show trial that it is to expose and embarrass the entire system institutionally. Mm-hmm. And he was told to go the institutional route because that would get him a better result. And we'll see. In this context, there are arguments for that, given that his audience is the Senate, lit for the mm-hmm. trial. But my view was that was never a real threat. And his power to motivate and leverage his audience, he could kill the Republican Party overnight and for as long as he wanted to. So he has far more leverage in this equation. They figured that out when they just poll tested the Patriot Party and realized they would lose pretty much half of their House seats, half of their Senate seats, a lot of their governorships, and have zero shot at the presidency. And Trump could do so just to be punitive. And if he couldn't get on the ballot, why not? I've been going around doing speeches at different places here in the States, and the level of anger here is off the charts. And their anger is not at what happened at Capitol Hill. Their anger is at the people who occupy that on a daily basis, not the people who occupied it on January 6th. And so he could have done that. Go into, why was there unusually low levels of security that day? Why were there infiltrators or instigators that turned out to be federal informants? That turn out to be on the BLM side of the equation or have been identified by Max Blumenthal and others as agent provocateurs, or as likely agent provocateurs. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about what exactly happened on January 6th that he could have used these proceedings to expose. For just one example, Pelosi and McConnell apparently were given very specific warnings and did not have their security step up. In fact, had their security go step down. Very unusual and peculiar behavior. I'm very curious about what McConnell knew and didn't know, what he told people, what he didn't tell people. Because having been around D.C., that was one of the lowest levels of security ever in modern history. Yeah. Exactly. When they were receiving warnings, what did the FBI in D.C. say? Did the FBI in D.C. honestly detail what took place? Because it appears there's a conflict. The Capitol Police said that FBI in Washington told them no worries, while FBI in New York and FBI in Virginia were screaming at the top of their lungs to the FBI major problems. And who is Trump's biggest adversary, arguably his entire 4 years? It was the 7th floor of the Hoover building and the FBI. And so would it be a great shock that they let their informants run amok? They may have helped infiltrate, instigate, and trap some of this activity, and that they knew about it and then got the Capitol Police to effectively stand down rather than stand up at critical junctures. It's going to be a lot of people have a lot of curiosity about what happened, but it appears the president's been told not to raise or inquire because he can use a Senate trial to subpoena evidence, but not to go to any of those places. Just to play nice, play quiet, keep his head low, and then they won't smack him when they were never going to smack him in the first place.
But
so
is it possible, like in an ordinary trial, a judge can rule that this is inadmissible evidence, it's irrelevant, and so on? Is that possible in this case? I mean, I don't know who, I mean, I guess Leahy say, no, we can't really go into that. This is irrelevant to everything. And all the stuff you want to talk about, what went on during the election and the fraud and everything, that's all irrelevant. And we're not going to have it. I mean, is that possible?
Oh, yes. But my view was to test that process, try to subpoena such evidence, try to document you're seeking such evidence. They call them proffers in our trials here in the States when the court won't let you get into anything. I will give a long proffer of what I would have been able to prove had they allowed the evidence in. And that allows you the rhetorical and political argument you want to make anyway, and exposes the trial as the sham that it is. And the Senate doesn't like to fancy itself the sham trial holders that they are. This would make, for all the criticism of the show trials of the Soviet Union and of Castro's Cuba right after the revolution, this trial makes more of a mockery of it because it pretends to be something it isn't. Some of those trials really didn't pretend that what they were. The whole point was power. Right. My view would be to expose it for what it is, make it the mockery that it is. You don't have to go full scale Chicago 7, but you could go part of the way there. I think some of the DC trials that we're heading to on the Capitol Hill issues may end up being mini Chicago 7 trials, because I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of controversy, but they have juries and judges who won't be fair about how the proceedings are. We already see that, witness that. But yeah, if I was Trump, when you have a joke of a trial, make sure the world knows it's a joke of a trial. But I don't think he's been told not to go that route. So his instincts would be to go that route. His lawyers don't want him to go that route because basically Lindsey Graham's running his defense.
So it's sorry, George.
No, go ahead.
What do you think, in light of all this and in light of the position that he then is taking on the advice that he's been given, does he stand to gain from this trial, if anything?
Oh, he just wants to avoid getting punished. He just wants to avoid a conviction, the history and legacy of a conviction, and the disbarment of not being able to use the leverage of running for future office. And he's still inclined to run again in 2024. That was his plan 4 months ago. As far as I knew. So there was a chance he wouldn't, but he was always going to say he was going to because he likes the leverage that it provides. To his credit, he woke up a little bit politically in threatening the third party, which some of us have been saying for him to do for a while, because to show, look, it's mutually assured destruction if you actually take me out. If I actually get criminally prosecuted, if I'm actually barred from office, if I'm actually convicted, then that's a problem for you guys more so than it is for me. And so they know that. And that's why, he didn't have quite the risk I think he thinks he does, but they've been able to bluff him for 4 years that, this terrible thing will happen if you don't play our game. And because he's unfamiliar with it and 90% of his advisors are useless, he ends up often, unfortunately, making mistakes in this precise context.
Yeah. But that's Steve Bannon he's been urging him all along to maximum defense, not just everything that happened on January the 6th, but bring up everything about the election. Let's go through Georgia, let's go through Arizona, let's go through Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, bring it all, detail it all, since this is all part of the impeachment that Trump has been lying for months and months about what happened. So no, here are the facts. Now that's Bannon, and that would have been Trump's one opportunity to lay it all out before the American people, which it hasn't happened. So that's a major opportunity that Trump is giving up.
He is, and it's another time where he's done that, but this is how he exited, unfortunately. But because the advice of some of us was even go broader than that. put the Senate on trial, put the FBI on trial, put the Capitol Police on trial, put the House on trial, put them all on trial, and force them to deal with who they are and what they are, in terms of not only what happened on the 6th, but why we ever got there. We got there because the Congress refusing to do its constitutional duty to meaningfully investigate and certify a presidential election. And they're not supposed to be certifying a presidential election where there are serious unanswered constitutional questions about the manner in which that election was conducted. Half the country believing that the election was stolen. They could have, and how did we even get to that point? Why are these institutions failing? Why is it that people, I mean, like Michael Malice's point was, when you have some guy in a buffalo outfit occupying the Senate, the chair of the Senate, literal chair, and the Washington's reaction is to go mad with anger and fear, that's a sign of a dying empire. It's not the sign of a rising sun. And so I think that you could put the whole system on trial as to how it even got here, like Chicago 7 did. Chicago 7 flipped the script and made it not just about Vietnam, but about the entire legal political system being a fraud. I mean, William Kunstler made his bones in that. Dershowitz was connected to that. So a range of people became famous off of that, where they were plainly guilty from just a straight up evidentiary perspective. But they ended up exposing the depth and breadth of Cook County corruption in the state and federal court system that was so embarrassing they had to let them all walk ultimately, so that the exposure would at least dim a little. So I was all in favor of using this show trial to make it a show of the Senate, make it a show of the House, make it a show of Wall Street, Washington, corruption institutionally. Put it in because in my view, it all relates to his context, his state of mind. Why did he believe that he had to generate massive political pressure for Congress to do its constitutional job that they'd been exercising in one capacity or another since 1809 in objecting to elections? Is because our system has become so institutionally and corrosively corrupt that it cannot answer the most basic questions and perform the most elementary tasks unless it's their Wall Street, Washington, swamp, or defense industry, deep state folks giving them directives. And I was all in favor of it. And bring up comparisons. Bring up all the senators who have been doing insider dealing, including the 2 who lost in Georgia, in part because of their history of insider dealing, and say, why are we, maybe it's time you put you guys on trial. Famously, Huey Long used to say that. Huey Long used to say, when the mob comes, I got to decide whether I stay in here and hang with you guys or if I go outside and lead them to come in. I'm all in favor of more unleashing populism, but Trump, it tends to be hesitant in areas he doesn't understand and defer to establishment people, which was ultimately this trial is, if it was a trial of Trump's 4 years, it's emblematic of what he faced, the absurdities of what he faced, but also certain weaknesses in his own style of governance.
Should he go?
Do you not think, sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to go off what you said about legacy and the fact that Trump was one of these very rare presidents who was elected to office without ever holding any elected office before, coming in with fresh, if naive, pair of eyes to the job itself, and then exposing all these frustrations and these deep-seated roots within the system, trying to unearth them to the public, given his connection with social media, etc., and his very direct connection with his base through those forms of communication. Do you think that anomaly was a timely thing, Trump's election to office, and the exposure of all these institutions and the corruption that you just described?
Yeah, well, I mean, I sort of had 3 goals when Trump got elected. My expectations were much less than his own voters in many respects. Just that he would be less interventionist than his predecessors in foreign policy, that he would take some sort of remedial actions on trade to make it a little more protective of American workers, and that he would expose the institutional deep state corrosive corruption of all of our institutions, which I'd hoped he would go further and actually replace a lot of these people. But just his existence, I was hopeful would expose these groups. And it did. And all 3 of those, he ended up achieving far more than I ever expected, frankly. I never expected much of the domestic legislative agenda because the he had so few institutional allies. It's what when we talked about the contesting the election back in November, said his biggest weakness is he's got no institutional allies, and that came home to roost at an extraordinary level. But he had the same problem. He had no real institutional allies in Congress legislatively or within the administrative state. But the amazing thing with Trump was he often just accidentally exposed the scope and scale and severity of corruption in our institutions, on Wall Street, in Washington, in the deep state, but particularly, especially the deep state. If you would have told me 10 years ago that you're going to have the Rush Limbaughs of the world preaching the evils of the deep state, even using the term, I'd have said, okay, that's just never going to happen. That's a pipe dream. A construct that came from, relatively moderate conservative circles in the late 19th century, the idea of a dual state, then developed by German emigres trying to understand the rise of fascism. And they're like, well, really this rise of an administrative state that's unchecked by democratic will allows for it to function independent of and separate from the actual elected government. And thus the dual state doctrine started becoming entrenched. And then it was the left that geniusly understood in the late 1960s, well, what happens when you take that dual state construct and you stick it in the national security apparatus? You give it the power of the FBI, you give it the power of the CIA, you give it the power of the NSA. Well, then you create a deep state. And whoever came up with that first term was just genius because it's deep in its corruption, deep in its shadowiness, deep in its degree of influence. And yet it was a construct that mostly stayed on the political margins. It was not part of your everyday. If you even said the word deep state 10 years ago, people would have not known what you were even talking about. Today, it's part of an ordinary person's lexicon. In 4 years, Trump took an eclectic construct that was actually very useful intellectually, but had been mostly inaccessible to the masses, and made it something that your taxi driver will ask you a question about. Your Uber driver will ask you a question about. Well, what do you think about all this deep state stuff, so on and so forth? That, I think, was the greatest success of Trump by far was he moved the Overton window dramatically. He did it on trade, he did it on war, but what he exposed in institutional deep state corruption was just fantastic, mostly just by being there, because these people were so used to power, so arrogated to it, and that true original definition of arrogance, that they thought they could do, that they were horrified that Trump had even achieved or attained any degree of influence, and so they exposed themselves in an effort to take down Trump. And Trump kept doing this. The degree of corruption in our institutional media was just because they went insane and were openly and so brazenly biased and prejudiced that because they hated Trump so much that people couldn't but see it or witness it. Trump didn't have to do anything but, like Peter Sellers in the movie, being there, just literally there. And that's the best part of Trump by far for the last 4 years. The degree to it, like whatever his limitations, whatever his failures, whatever things he left on the table, exposing the institutional corruption such that it's not a surprise that the media attributes to the GameStop revolution, these populist traders taking on the biggest hedge fund boys and beating them at their own game to the point where they go crying to mommy and asking her mommy to intervene to stop the mean bullies on Reddit from beating up these poor billionaires who only have 2 yachts apiece. So it's that probably happens more because of what Trump has exposed, almost unintentionally. That people are like, all of these people are just emperors with no clothes. And once more people realize it, the game is on.
That's really very interesting, because to the extent that these ideas had existed 20, 30, 40 years ago, they were ideas on the left. It is fascinating to watch the migration of these ideas to the right. It's the right now that talks about the deep state, and then what you'd call the left, who are basically saying these are good guys, these are patriotic, loyal Americans, and it's, then they have to protect the country from the likes of Trump and Putin and the rest. And even what we've had in the last couple of days of GameStop, it's the right who's suddenly railing against Wall Street. These hedge fund, these vulture capitalists, it's who are screwing the little guy, and how all the institutional mechanism is protecting the hedge funds. This is an extraordinary transformation, and all these
Massive.
yeah, and these
Look,
neocons. I mean, that's why the neocons kind of abandoned the Republican Party because, hey, we don't like this. Suddenly, we're the enemy.
well, as I was describing to someone the other day, how to summarize GameStop, and I said, well, the peasants just keep finding new pitchforks. But their desire to find those new pitchforks isn't going away. And the institution, one of the biggest mistakes the institutions made that they're starting to glimpse is that their mythology of populism was that populism is led by these demagogic characters who just get the masses unduly upset. And if you could just take out those characters, all the problem goes away. Not recognizing populism is an idea fundamentally. And it's an idea that's been deeply embedded in the ordinary person's life experience. And that's why it is so resistant to the virus of either neoliberalism or neoconservatism. You can try to tell them 100 times that trade is a wonderful thing for their working class industrial northern neighbors, but they're not going to believe it because they won't see it. And so that's where it really comes from. And they really think that, only because William Jennings Bryan was endorsed by the People's Party, that the People's Party only existed because of William Jennings Bryan. All you got to do is read a book like Lawrence Goodwin's The Populist Moment and know how completely untrue that was. And this was always true with Trump. Trump is just a marketer and a salesman at heart. That's what he does great. That's what he does. Now, he has some populist instincts from growing up around a bunch of New York construction workers from the time he was a teenager, where his father would drop him off on work projects. But he's not. No one would confuse him with a populist intellectual. I mean, he even used the word popularist. That was his definition of populist. God bless him, because that's not who he is, and he doesn't even pretend to be that. He was never trying to be an academic. He was never trying to be a think tank guy. He just wanted to sell and sell well, and he just decided to, hey, maybe I can do this in politics. And the reason he succeeded where no one else did is because he had a bunch of people who did nothing more than follow popular sources of information in the country from 2012 to 2016. So they just listened to Michael Savage and Alex Jones and your independent talk radio folks and your independent social media folks. That's what he used Twitter for, to follow what was popular within his populist base. And that's how he got tapped into populism. Trump didn't create populism. Populism created Trump. Trump rode the wave of populism to success. And they really believed that when they had the January 6th event, they could say, now we can finally discredit Trump, and now we can finally put this populism thing to bed. And they just had no understanding. I mean, it's very much a let them eat cake society. Best represented in what that judge did yesterday of denying bail to someone for very minor offenses. The way they were shaking in rage, the way the judge couldn't withstand it, what happened and to what took place, as if this was 9/11 times 2, as AOC. I thought I was going to be murdered. I mean, it's just preposterousness. But what it reveals is the degree to which they are completely out of touch. This is really French royalty who don't understand the revolution happening right outside their doors. This is Russia 1916. And it's like, oh, they're going to want to whack all of us. They can't comprehend it even, because populism is a force. Populism is an idea. And if anything, as the big boys on Wall Street are learning, Trump hemmed it in. Trump didn't unleash it. Trump gave it a channel for expression that often cabined the scope of that expression. Now let's watch what happens when there's no top on it. And I think the ball game is going to change, and that's going to be Trump's great lasting legacy, was validating the idea of populism, the idea of the deep state, and how it applies in the modern world. The ideas on trade, war, immigration, deep state control. People understand. Like, if you would have told me 5 years ago, even, that the guys like Rush Limbaugh would be saying, I think the deep state forced George W. Bush into the Iraqi war and tricked him into it. And he was one of the biggest champions of the Iraqi war. Now he's totally reversed. Dan Bongino just yesterday was bashing Wall Street like an 1890s People's Party member, in ways that even Bernie would be bashful to do. So the one person who needs to step up more to reignite the populist left is Bernie, but they've bought him off so effectively with, hey, you're going to be the chair of the budget committee, Bernie, that he says a little bit, but then he won't go 3 steps further. You have guys like the Barstool president. This is just a sports network, sports betting network, and he's waging complete war on guys like Stephen Cohen, with the guy that the show Billions was built on. You're talking about one of the most corrupt, nefarious, but incredibly successful Wall Street tycoons in American history. And the little Barstool president guy is like, you're going to jail. You belong in jail. So much that Cohen's agitated, was actually responding to him on social media saying, please no. So it is incredible we're seeing a degree of populist revolution that's spreading in such a way they're not going to be able to put out the flames anymore. And they're starting to realize, oh, golly gee, this wasn't because of Trump. Trump was because of them. And what happens if Trump's not there to divert them? Maybe they come for us. So I think that's going to be the beauty of what we're witnessing in live time. We're seeing a real populist revolution in America that is, and what's nice also to see going to the left-right dialogue, you're seeing the hardcore independent left journalists be all over this. People like Matt Taibbi, people like Glenn Greenwald, people like that, people like Jimmy Dore. They completely embrace the GameStop revolution. They're attacking aspects of the impeachment as a joke. They are critiquing the institutions for where they want to go, attacking their efforts to do domestic terror laws, attacking their efforts to do mass censorship, attacking the collusion that took place yesterday with Robinhood, an app supposedly designed for the people named Robinhood, that it turns out was meant to rob from the people for the big, powerful privileged classes. And you're going to see more of that. Like, I mean, you had the young Republicans of New York proposing Occupy 2.0, occupying Wall Street next week, or this weekend, even potentially. That's something that nobody in the establishment even thought possible. And
do you think it might be advisable for Trump just to hold back for about a year and let the populist wave just explode? And then he might return as the one person who can actually keep this under control, because everybody else, it just could sweep everybody else away.
I think
Robert, I also think from what George is saying, do you not think that stepping back a tad from the movement itself will let it flourish into something that no one has imagined previously?
I think we're seeing it at a much faster pace. I sort of, in going around and talking to crowds, I've personally never seen the level of anger, frustration, irritation at the system, and a desire to do something constructive and productive. And I'm talking about like small country crowds and as well as urban crowds. So I was like, wow, what's happening here is something very, very different than they expect. Like in DC, they really thought after the January 6th riots, they would go home and have this mass demand like Nixon 74, which there never really was that much mass demand, but they pretended there was, that, oh, we just have to take out Trump. This is a stain on the conscience of American society, this embarrassment. Look at these rubes occupying these positions of respect. And instead they came home, Republican congressmen, Republican senators. I mean, Lindsey Graham couldn't even get through the airport without being harangued and saying, what kind of wuss are you? What kind of weakling are you? And some of them are saying stuff like, January 6th just fine with me. And this totally shocked House and Senate members. They should have realized there was a part of what happened on January 6th that were criminal conspirators. And there was a part of it that were just a bunch of peasants deciding, you know what, that's supposed to be the people's house, so I think I'm going to occupy it for the day. And they didn't understand that. They still don't understand that. They don't appreciate that. And when they got the shock of that interaction, they started to step back a little bit. They should have stepped back a lot more, of course. And if Trump was smart, a strategy would be to sit back and plot and let things run amok and let the world see what the way it is. It's if Trump's politically smart. Trump's political intelligence is in the persuasion world. It's not always in the strategy world. And I say that as someone who likes the guy. It was fun to talk to him on the phone, about a month ago. And he's still a very smart guy, politically savvy. gets totally unrattled by things. He has the like I've always been intrigued by Putin's emotional equilibrium because of how he navigates things. Trump, though, I think is at an even different level than that. It's like the world could be burning around entirely all around him, and he's like, yeah, okay, I'm probably going to get through there, and everything's going to be good. You know, he just has this persistent, perennial optimism that often is not quite rational,
right.
but it often pays off for him. It's a real testament to the power of mindset. So I think he clearly has the capacity to rebuild the populist movement and to reinvigorate it from an electoral perspective. And what he does institutionally, form a PAC, form a media network, form a radio, and form tech companies, or at least lend his name to them for the purposes of monetizing them and building up their brand. I know he's thinking about it, but it was just like Trump's 4 years. Exactly how that all plays out is an open question, because in the area of management, Trump has been hit or miss because he's often had very poor allies around.
But he's also got the problem of communication, because Twitter's gone for him. We don't know what the future of Parler is, so he's gone from Facebook. I don't even know whether Fox News is going to have him on a regular basis. I mean, Sean Hannity might have him on, but I don't know about anyone else. So to build a movement, Trump needs a lot of communication. He needs a big platform. Where's that going to come from?
Well, I think it's fascinating is, you know, in representing dissidents over the years, in the civil and criminal context, like when they came after certain tax groups and other groups, I used to tell the system, it's like, you realize that you're making them more sophisticated, right? You're teaching them to only communicate by these means, only interact with these means, store their assets in these means, their means of exchange of currency, their means of communication. You're making them like what we did with Al Qaeda in the 1990s and late 1980s and helped create them, of course. God bless the CIA. Its legacy just keeps blossoming on. But and that's what they're doing now to the entire populist movement. Like with what they did with GameStop and shutting down the Robinhood app, and what they did with Trump. Like, one, they badly jumped the gun by doing it while he's president, because that was going to terrify every politician in the world. They're going to be like, hold on a second. You think you can shut me down? That's all. You know, they were supposed to wait until he was no longer president. And now 20% of people have they've purged a bunch of people, but there's a whole bunch of people that left Twitter, and they can take out Parler and do all of that. But like, where Trump could be very effective is to lend his blessing. It's a win-win for Trump, which is amazing. They created a situation where Trump can get even wealthier by attacking the system and creating independent means of capital, independent means of credit, independent means of communication in technology and the media and in banking and in finance. And they've and make him rich in the process, because what is they've now created the demand. I know all kinds of high-end people that are like, why do I have this corporate law firm? Why do I have this bank? Or ordinary people, why am I using Twitter or Facebook anymore? Why am I lending in its content anymore? Why am I using Google anymore? Why am I doing any of these things if they're going to censor me or suppress me or manipulate me? They're supposed to keep the manipulation quiet with algorithmic manipulation, not just be outright suppressing and censoring information that every Joe Schmo can witness, to where now they're educating every trader in the country that, oh, by the way, we won't even let you trade if you're trying to threaten our power. The people they are radicalizing overnight what I've been pitching to Trump's people is, why not just support an independent media network? And he could just lend his name to it, like he started doing in real estate the last 20 years. Doesn't even have to be institutionally committed. Doesn't have to own equity. Just say, okay, in exchange for X percentage of gross revenues, like he does with real estate, I will lend my name and get my audience to you. I'll help, because what do I do better than anything? I sell. And the way I'll sell is I'll sell your network to my audience of 75 million plus voters, which is actually, in terms of audience support, it's 100 million plus. I mean, half of the interactions on Twitter each day were with Trump in some capacity. I mean, or half the people on Twitter. I mean, that's why they were there. Twitter wasn't a big deal in 2015. It wasn't until Trump made Twitter. Twitter didn't make Trump. Trump made Twitter, and old Jackie Boy is figuring that out. And he's about to get sued into oblivion by costing his shareholders billions of dollars, just like all these big boys are about to start to get sued for what they did with Robinhood collusion. Just because you can't sue because of the regulation of big free speech doesn't mean you can't sue for regulation of the stock market. or illicit controls and censorship of it. So I think if the president's smart, form your own TV station, but you don't even have to own it. Just associate with it with a marketing deal. Same with technology. Figure out whether it's going to be Gab or Telegram or whomever. You're going to promote them exclusively in exchange for some sort of revenue component. Do the same with web browsers. Do the same with email servers. Do the same with payment processors. Do the same with banks and financial institutions. Lend your name to those institutions, and you can monetize your audience for yourself. So that's good for Trump, win-win, and build up an independent network of communications and currency and a means of exchange and capital and credit that's outside of the institutional controls, and that's Trumpist or populist in orientation. That's what the populist moment was all about. They came up with all these creative, fascinating ways, and these guys were they were little farmers. They'd been farmers for generations, for centuries. So it wasn't like they weren't getting their degree at Harvard. They weren't MIT boys, but they figured out all the creative ways to take on people that nobody thought you could take on, like the general store and the railroads that literally own the politicians. They used to walk around the halls of the state legislatures and give them shares right before the vote. And it was the election of his fraudulency the first, Rutherford B. Hayes. I like to call Joe Biden his fraudulency the second, in honor of Rutherford B. Hayes, but who helped birth the whole populist movement in America, because people were like, man, this is bad. This is terrible. It was the same deal as what we're seeing now. It was across the board on left and right. You had the Henry George and the Georgist movement on the left. Aspects of populism was always on the left, depending on how you define it. And then unleashed populism on the right with the People's Party, which had leftist components. It was really a hybrid. But in the South, for example, it was a coalition of poor whites and ex-slaves. So it was very much on the left. That's why they wouldn't let either one of them vote later on by 1900 in Mississippi. That's why in
Robert, can I just ask that? I just wanted to add that with the Reddit and GameStop situation, it's not even just an American question of American citizens getting involved in this. It's like an international stick it to the man sort of meme rolled into itself. And it goes beyond borders. It's not just in the US. It's people who are also saying, well, you know what? I don't agree with the fact that Wall Street controls this so tightly, and I'm going to show that I can actually have an impact in the game, as it were, that's unexpected and financially ruining to all these big hedge fund managers. And on that line, on the same line of internationalism, I just want to get your opinion on the legacy of Trump in terms of the international opinion of the US, which I know from personal experience with all the rioting this year has seen, with the Capitol being stormed. People internationally in the international community were shocked, in a way that, coming from the esteemed America of yore, let's say, the land of opportunity and mystery, and particularly being Irish, I know that this strikes a chord with many Irish people as holding American in very high esteem. That has vastly degraded over the past 6-7 years. And I just want to get your opinion on how you see that degradation and the opinion of the international community changing towards America. What you have to say about that?
Yeah, Michael Malice would love your analysis right there. That's his whole point. Brilliant. Yeah, actually, I think his family's originally ancestrally Russian.
Really?
He is. Yeah, fascinating little guy. I shouldn't say little guy. He is a little guy, but fun guy, very smart, very brilliant. But one of the true sort of the inheritor to a certain degree of the Lysander Spooner intelligent anarchistic theories. So there was not anarchy for its own sake, but for certain principled purposes that he articulates well. And his point is a system of government that's really respected doesn't get a mob to raid the Capitol. When you see a mob raid the Capitol, it means there's a mass contempt for our supposed betters. And it'll be interesting how it's interpreted around the world internationally, because what is fascinating right now is you have really sort of a legitimate political protest mixed with criminal actions in the riot circumstance. that here in the States has been used as the pretext by the press and the political class and the professional class to want to crack down and crush them wherever and whenever they can, to the degree of imprisoning them without trial for as long as they possibly can for nonviolent offenses, like the guy who took an open letter off of Pelosi's desk and put his feet up on her desk that triggered judicial rage. Well, at the same time, the United States is attacking Russia for clearly staged, at least partially staged protests for the Lyndon LaRouche of Russia, Mr. Navalny, who's got like deep state tattooed on his forehead. So what to me is fascinating is how the United States says this is outrageous that anybody connected to Navalny goes to jail for a day while they're trying to lock up as many of their own citizens as possible on political grounds. And it's like they don't even understand the dissonance between that presentation internationally. So I think that, I mean, Biden, I'll be curious how people interpret Biden over time. And one of the fascinating things is where the press has been really powerful is more in covering international figures within a domestic environment. So like where like a person's lived experience was enough to push back on the American media's bashing of Trump, which he was attacked more than any president by far in history, but a lot like other populists have been attacked in the past. Huey Long got 95% negative coverage. Big Jim Folsom got 95% negative coverage. Bookie Turner from my hometown got elected while under federal indictment to the police position, no less. Great populist in my hometown. He got 95% plus negative media coverage. But so the ordinary person has enough common experience to be able to push back against that within the domestic audience. But you take someone like Putin, who in Russia, probably one of the most easily misunderstood across the entire political spectrum, no matter whether you're left or right. I mean, outside of really independent people who follow the news in great detail. Like when I went to Russia in 2006, was complete. I had bought into most of the mythology surrounding Putin, terrible, horrible dictator, all this stuff. And I started talking to ordinary, everyday people, and it was clear they loved the guy. And they couldn't quit talking about the guy. And at first I thought some of it was like when I've hypothetically been in Cuba, the Cuban population didn't hesitate to tell me how terrible the regime was and this problem and that problem and another problem. It's like sort of a weirdly suppressive place that they're happy to share this. But in Russia, it was just the opposite. And then I started studying more, getting more independent sources of information, and realizing the story was very different than what the institutional narrative was. But in the United States, this is what actually made me go from just thinking about betting on Trump to being a fan of Trump, was when he was willing to challenge the institutional narrative on Putin. He's like, wouldn't it be better if we just all got along? They have a lot of nuclear weapons. Maybe that's just a better idea, folks. And I was like, wow, if he's willing to challenge that narrative, he's willing to challenge any institutional narrative, because in the States, Putin had a 1% approval rating. I mean, because if you're in the States, it's amazing. People just swallow and regurgitate the institutional narrative if it involves a foreign official.
But you remember sorry to interrupt, just following up on that. I remember when Bill O'Reilly said to Trump, but Putin's a murderer. And then Trump said, yeah, well, we've murdered people in the past. And the media world just went crazy. But everyone knows, of course, that Trump was, he was correct. Of course, Americans have murdered in the past and assassinated political leaders in the past. But it's unthinkable for an aspirant to be president to openly admit that, okay, so Putin's done that, we've done that.
Well, it's fascinating to me. I mean, our imagination, it is incredible. Almost all the things they accuse Trump of, you're going to see Biden be guilty of. The confession through projection, what the West imagines Putin is thinking and is up to and obsessing over, are things that they're up to, involved with, or obsessing over. I've never understood, thinking that Putin wanted to destabilize the United States. That makes no sense at all. He has zero interest in that. If you've studied anything he's done for 20 years, he would just like the U.S. to be less crazy, not more crazy, less crazy. As most
of the world, Robert.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
Most of the world.
And the ordinary person here in the States doesn't fully get that, because when it comes to international events, they tend to buy whatever the institutional narrative is. Now, I think what GameStop, what Trump is starting to do is to unmask all of that. He took the FBI, unmasked them for the ugly entity they are, took the judiciary and unmasked them for what they are. The media unmasked them completely for what they are. And now what people are seeing is that people are starting to take that same strategy in their own hands. And what GameStop did was unmask Wall Street for who they were, to where little Benji Shapiro was shaking. He's like, no, Wall Street is where people go to allocate capital to make sure it's perfectly done in this nice way to efficiently run business. Wall Street's never been about perfectly allocating capital to help productive businesses. They're about sinking the little guy to put more money in their own pocket. That's why Oliver Stone's Wall Street was so successful. The Charlie Sheen's character is kind of like someone who grew up on Ben Shapiro and thinks this is how Wall Street works, and thinks that Dear Gordon Gekko is there to really help the union, not use the union to gut the business and enrich himself. And this is the best populist revolution I've seen in terms of small scale, the GameStop revolution, and it's a function of what Trump unleashed. And for that, I will be eternally thankful. I think he did great on trade. I think first president not to start a new war, and challenged the deep state. And he achieved real policy outcomes in trade that were meaningful. The first president to tear up a trade deal in forever, first president to renegotiate NAFTA, first president to actually take on China's dominance of our manufacturing, first president to not start a new war in pretty much forever. I mean, at least since Jimmy Carter, at least try to descale our involvement around the world. I mean, that's why they lied to him for 4 years about what our actual military presence was in different countries. But in the end, his limitations were he deferred to McConnell for executive branch appointees and judicial branch appointees. He deferred to both Ryan and McConnell for his legislative agenda. And he surrounded himself with people who couldn't wait to play Brutus. And if you want to be Caesar, you can't hire a bunch of Brutuses.
What I'd say then on the other side, now he failed to improve relations with Russia. I mean, there are reasons for that, but he failed to do that. He got himself into an unnecessary conflict with Iran. There was really no reason to do that. He failed to extricate the United States from Syria, even though he kept promising to do so. He failed to do that. And then it got into a conflict with Venezuela, regime change in Venezuela. So you've got that on the sort of negative side, where clearly Trump did not pursue, I suppose, a Trumpian agenda.
Yeah, the big weakness was he did not have the intellectual infrastructure to push through particular policies, and didn't have and to get certain personnel that were necessary. I mean, one of the best books I was telling people to read early on, I said with Trump, was I read Pat Buchanan's book about the internal administrative difficulties with early Nixon, because you're going to see a lot of striking parallels, and you do, that personnel is policy. And I mean, when I was there early on, I warned everybody connected to Trump, this town is coming for you. And they thought I was a conspiracy nut. I mean, it was funny. They're like, oh, okay, whatever. I was like, no, you don't understand. Like, no, this town hates the man, and they will do everything possible to weaponize their access. That what separates the neoliberals from the left is the neoliberals are truly statist at heart from a professional class deferential basis. Is what they share in common with the old Soviet left, the old communist left. You could argue it goes back to the old Marxist anarchist debate of the late 19th century about the problem of when you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, it ends up just being a dictatorship, and the proletariat part goes away because that's the nature of power. So where he failed to go far enough was where he put in personnel that were undermining him every day. I mean, Pompeo was a disgrace. Haspel was a disgrace. Wray was a disgrace. Mueller, he's indirectly responsible for. But Sessions and Barr and Huber and Durham. I mean, you bring in a guy like Bill Barr to be your attorney general when he's a Poppy Bush guy who got his political start, aside from his dad's weird books about underage sexual activities and hiring, Jeffrey Epstein, putting all that aside, from the rich side of Upper West Side of Manhattan, to the guy who got his political start by helping Poppy Bush hide CIA crimes from the Church Committee. This is the guy that's going to expose Spygate. So it was always a problem. but you couldn't get through to Trump because the problem was Trump really, he was a brilliant marketer, brilliant salesman, but what he did not appreciate, what he himself underappreciated, was how corrupt the deep state really is. So he didn't understand. I wrote an article in 2017 in American Thinker saying if Bannon is gone, Trump is in trouble because he's got no allies up there. And one man can't pass a set of policies. One man can't enforce a set of policies. So he could say, I want all the troops home from Afghanistan, unless he's got a bunch of people around him who want the same thing. It won't happen, which is I mean, how prescient Putin turned out to be and telling Oliver Stone, I think all these presidents mean well, but sooner or later, it's the little gray men who run your country. And that turned out to be true. The way he got blackmailed into not creating détente with Russia. So there were so many places where he could have meaningful détente with Russia to help isolate them and to put more pressure on China, to help align in the war against radical Islamic terrorism, to stabilize and bring peace to the Middle East, because that Russia has its own reasons that want that to occur, was a major missed opportunity on his part. Meaningful changes to the Patriot Act law when he had been the victim of it was a major limitation. The failure to impose real tax reform on the populist side of the aisle. He did for the big corporations, but he didn't tax hedge fund people like he had promised he would and was planning to. No major infrastructure investment. Imagine if there'd been Trump projects all across the country, highways, bridges, better roads. He would have won with these. He let them talk him into not doing it. He never did finish building that wall. He only built a very small part of it. And so in those areas, the weakness was his tendency to defer to the political establishment that always wanted to gut him. He really believed that they would just come around. They would realize, look, I'm the best persuader in the room. They need me for political power. And I'm right about trade and war. This is ultimately in our own financial self-interest. Whatever you think about these ideas in general, this just makes sense. So surely they'll just come around to it. Not recognizing it's not like the free market economic space he was used to occupying. People don't make rational decisions that serve the public's interest because that's not their real constituency. Their constituency is who's going to give me the book deal. Their constituency is who's going to help me with my insider stock sale. Their constituency is who's going to give me a little nice professorship gig after all of this is over. Who's going to let me maintain my status and be an important opinion in the scope of the press. I mean, there's a reason why the media loves to have Mitt Romney on every week. He figured out the game. If I'm an institutional media deferential person imitating their narrative, they'll let me be on. I'll get to be on Meet the Press once every month. This is how these people think. They think like high schoolers. That's what Tulsi Gabbard did a great job of detailing in the Joe Rogan interview. That Congress is a bunch of kids. They're literally they're the cool kids who still think they're the cool kids, who, when they realize that they're not really the cool kids and that the athletes are here to come and beat them up, they're horrified, and they behave that way. So what they value is not the American interest, and Trump never fully got that. He didn't get that institutional power in D.C. values its power more than anything. He should have read and watched a lot more of John le Carre. Then he would have understood the mindset of spies from that great dialogue at the end of...
The parallel with Nixon is kind of interesting because Nixon was also a populist. I mean, the guy with a silent majority, I mean, he knew what he was doing when he unleashed the silent majority on the government. And then, the deep state went after him. Now, of course, he did make mistakes, but think of it like this. Suppose it hadn't been Nixon who had done all of those things. Suppose it had been a Democrat. Suppose it had been LBJ or Kennedy. Would he have been impeached? No, the Democrats would have stuck by him. Democrats pulled it off because they could always pick off. You can always pick off all the Mitt Romneys among the Republicans. And that's what they did during Watergate. Remember William Cohen, the conscience of he was on the House Judiciary Committee and voted to impeach Nixon. You could always count on, 25% of Republicans who are going to go over with you, whereas the Democrats will stick by him. And had it been Johnson would not have been impeached.
The way I'm describing it is America's in a sort of late 60s, historically analogous political time. But what's different is it's still run by like the people who are running both parties in the early 60s. So you still have the neoliberal McNamara types running the Democratic Party. You still have the George Romneys of the world running the Republican Party. And they just haven't been effectively purged like the political process was allowed to do. And that's because our institutions are atrophying so badly that they're lashing out with such corrupt actions that they're not allowing the popular will to be popularly represented. And all that does is breed more dissent and more means of rebellion. And that's what I think is deeply misunderstood. I mean, that's where they should have gone along with some of Trump's stuff. Pull out of Syria. Don't get involved in any further involved in Libya. Don't continue to be involved in supporting the Yemen disaster war. That was probably, in my view, Trump's greatest failure on the foreign policy scene was letting the Yemen war continue. Now, in Trump's mind, no U.S. soldiers are on the ground, so that's not a big deal to him. He comes from that wing of populism it's about protecting the soldier's life, not about protecting foreign life. But even he, I think, would be bothered if he knew the real numbers. I have no doubt they never gave him the real numbers. They made sure Ivanka got the fake images in order to promote the bombing of Syria. But there I give Trump credit. I mean, you couldn't have had a more useless bombing than in the history of bombings. I mean, purely made for TV. By the way, call everybody in advance. Make sure the airport's empty. Make sure nobody's there. But make the bombs look really cool for TV. The one time the media celebrated him, showed what the media was really all about, and they're bashing Trump. But they didn't see what was happening in Yemen. But what I give Trump credit for is I thought the system is so institutionally corrupt that I didn't think he could achieve even what he did achieve. I didn't think he would be able to scale down on the scope of conflict. I thought he would avoid a new war, but I didn't think we would at least have less of a footprint in Syria, less of a footprint in Libya, less of a footprint in Iraq, less of a footprint in Afghanistan, less of a footprint in parts of Africa, less of a footprint even in Germany and North Korea. Now, I would have liked Trump to have gone all the way. Why not get out of NATO? It makes no sense at this point. He was right the first time. Yeah. Why do we still have troops in South Korea? I mean, how does that serve any purpose? His other great missed opportunity is I think if he doesn't make bad personnel choices, he does get an extraordinary peace deal with North Korea. And I think that would have been an exceptional achievement, both in terms of dealing with China, because China uses North Korea as their little terrier on the world to discipline them, but also because it's the real great threat. Potentially, a nuclear bomb could hit potentially at least Hawaii currently. And I think he was close to it. But for letting why he hired John Bolton. I mean, these are just insane provisions. I gave him credit for hiring Elliot Abrams. I was like, if you want to tell the world, by the way, I have a bunch of conspiratorial kooks who want to overthrow governments throughout Latin America, at least let it be the guy who's known for it. It's like, look, I'm putting the nut job in charge. It's like putting Curtis LeMay in charge of a bombing campaign. It's like that's fairness in advertising. But the way I used to try to get Trump's attention. I used to tell people around him, I was like, the best way to get for Trump to pay attention is to go up, slap him in the face, spit in his face. Then he'll drop to his knees and beg you to give you a job, because that's what he did, frankly, for many years. And I say that as someone who liked Trump, but it was a fundamental weakness and limitation. And you're right, it was very Nixonian. I mean, people still forget. Nixon wasn't taken out because he was corrupt. Nixon was taken out because he tried to purge the FBI of its Hoover influence. Right. I had this argument with Ben Bradley almost 20 years, actually more than 20 years ago, at the Washington Post, where there was a bunch of us that were down there for a meeting with him, and he was talking about Deep Throat. And I asked him, I said, and this was before it was public knowledge, it was Mark Felt. I said, what if the real reason you're covering up Deep Throat is not because you want to protect anonymity, but because if people knew who that was, they would see it as a coup. They would see it as corruption, and that you facilitated and enabled it. And he got a wry smile and went no further. And of course, that turned out to be precisely what it was. I mean, Ben Bradley started out that way by covering up JFK's crimes when he was a young reporter in the early 1960s and other licentious behavior. So Trump achieved far more than I thought he could. He didn't get anywhere near what his objectives were, by his own description, or by what his audience would like. And he went out on a very weak note, and he kept showing signs. Once he fired Flynn so easily, he showed the system, you can threaten Trump and you can bluff Trump, and he'll fold, because this is a world he doesn't understand yet. And he still doesn't understand it. I mean,
well, Robert, in one brief conclusion, I think more power to people to hold power accountable. And this is sort of enabled, in my opinion, it's enabled people to have at least the confidence to do that, to say, no, you know what, this is not right, therefore I will do something about it. And in that sense, I think, especially as a part of holding power accountable for their actions, it's a very important legacy to leave.
Well, William Appleman Williams, the great American historian who wrote Contours of American History, explained that American foreign policy leaders were obsessed with examples, that they would be obsessed with a Cuba, not because it had any real meaningful power to influence American direction directly, but because of the example of Cuba could unleash revolutionary instincts around the Latin world. And that's what Trump did. Trump validated the power of populism, validated the idea of populism, shifted the Overton window dramatically for new policies to be considered legitimate and credible, and and this is the reason why they want to make an example of him negatively. That's why they want to destroy him, discredit him, imprison him if they could. Definitely disbar him from office, because they want to send a message to other people. You better not try what Trump did. Look what we'll do. And they don't realize that it really is an I am Spartacus moment, not the fake Cory Booker kind, but the real from the cinema kind, where basically people are learning anybody can be Trump. You can just be a bunch of little Redditors, and you can do stuff that even Trump couldn't imagine doing, taking out some of the biggest Wall Street hedge funds in the world, exposing the system for the whole world to see, the media collusion, the tech collusion, you name it. So the example of Trump is, in my view, from a populist perspective, one of the greatest achievements of the Trump presidency.
Well,
thanks so much,
that's
Robert.
a very good, very good place to finish. I think that's you gave an outstanding summary of the strengths and weaknesses of Trump, and we'll see what the future holds. As Trump himself would say, we'll see what happens. So thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, Ciara, and thank you all for watching this fascinating discussion. And remember, if you like The Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.